It's the middle of May and I'm still wearing jumpers. The heating was on this morning. My God. People don't believe in climate change. So I'm currently looking at a desk which has 17 books on it. It's a mess. It's an absolute mess. I'm absolute chaos goblin. And I say this as someone because I love books, but sometimes I actually can't bear to look at them. Because as you can see, I live in a room where I have hundreds of unread spines. They line my shelves because I tend to put the books I want to read to the front and then books I have read to the back. So I'm literally confronted with unread books. And it's part of my PhD because I need those for easy access. So that section's fine. The rest of it can give or take. And most days it's actually incredibly invigorating, but on my dark days, which are kind of frequent and not that great, they tend to be quite accusatory, to say the least, because each of them feels like a promise that I made myself that I haven't kept, or, a life that I intended to live, or a mind I intended to build, or a self that I intended to become and haven't. And I think most of us here on this channel are familiar with the Japanese word Tsundoku, which is the intentional act of accumulating books with the intention of reading them in the future, but in the meantime they just exist as piles of unread books all around oneself. Now, I read a BBC article about it, and apparently, according to an academic, the writer Mori Senzo said that the phrase Sudoku sensei was first used in 1879, representing a teacher who had lots of books around them, but never read them. And though that sounds like a critical thing to do, the term is far from pejorative, because the intentionality behind Sudoku is a positive one, because it's not considered the same as hoarding or collecting for the sake of hoarding and collecting, which is lovely. I'm glad they're less judgmental, seemingly, but I can't say the sentiment is shared over here in the UK, and possibly not shared in places like the United States and Canada, from what I've seen online. A few years ago there was this trend of unhauling books, where content creators film themselves purging their shelves, with a few of them citing feelings of shame and overwhelm as their motivation behind the video. And I honestly think this perspective of book ownership goes back to the shame of being perceived, which I discussed in my video on Sartre. To briefly recap, in Being and Nothing, Sartre gives an example of a person looking through a keyhole, and in their pre-reflective state, the person peering through the keyhole is entirely absorbed in the action. They are pure consciousness, directed outward to a scene on the other side of the door. Now, in this state, the person has no self-consciousness. They have no ego. They are merely the act of looking. But when the person hears the footsteps along the corridor or the creaking of the floorboards, the voyeur becomes aware that suddenly they too are being watched. Now, upon this realization, the voyeur transforms. They are no longer a free, active subject, but an objectified person. They are the peeping Tom. So they cease being the voyeur and suddenly they become an object that is viewed and judged by the other. Now, in the age of the internet, people who discuss their love of books often go through a similar transformation, or so I perceive it as, because the shame of needing to purge one's books, I would argue, largely comes from being perceived as having not read the books they own, or being lazy, or greedy, or a show-off, or pretentious, or fake, or elitist. But these are feelings that they would likely not have were their status as a reader, or even their library, not be seen or known by other people other than themselves. But how can this be argued for someone who's not a content creator? Well, I would argue that those who do not share their reading online become aware of what it may feel like to be perceived through their perceiving of others, because they can understand how they judge others and therefore feel their vulnerability to the same eyes of perception. Through comparison of others, they can evaluate themselves as a good reader or a bad reader, a fast reader or a slow reader, a lazy reader, someone who reads 100 books in a year and someone who doesn't read that much, etc. Then, in the privacy of their own homes, they feel the burning eyes of the hypothetical judgment, perhaps even echoes of judgments that they themselves have passed upon others or seen in comments. And soon the private space of one's library becomes a heavy, suffocating environment, reverberating sneers and tuts of the imagined but seemingly very real other, the judge who formulates meaning out of superficial data. So what are we to do with this form of spiritual analysis? Well, ironically, the answer may lie in our ability to learn how to talk about the books we haven't read, just as well as we can talk about the books that we have read. But before we go into today's video in depth, I'd like to give a huge thank you to today's sponsor, which is June's Journey. Now, you may not know this about me, but I do love a mobile game, and I particularly love a thematic mobile game. And June's Journey is a mystery detective game set in the 1920s, I know, love that period, where you're solving hidden object scenes whilst uncovering this whole family drama and a murder mystery storyline. The art style is wonderfully detailed, and every scene feels packed with little clues and things that you can miss if you're not paying attention. What I like the most about it is that it doesn't feel repetitive. 1 minute you can be searching through hidden object levels, trying to spot tiny details, and then in the next you're unlocking the new story moments or events and rewards. And then once you get a little further in, you can even decorate your own island and customise everything there, which is relaxing. You know, it's a bit like, you know, just chilling out and designing things. It's become one of those games that I open, I'll just play it for a few minutes, and then suddenly I'm playing away for like half an hour because I want to actually know the next scene or unlock the next chapter of the story. So it's sort of the perfect mix of like cosy but challenging, and also if you're into storylines and you like those hooks, it's one of those. I really enjoy it. Also, what's wonderful is that they're constantly adding seasonal events and limited time activities, so there's usually something new going on every time you come to play it. So if you want to try it for yourself, download June's Journey for free using the link in my description, or scan the QR code on the screen right now. It's available on iOS, Android and PC. Thank you again, June's Journey, for sponsoring today's video. So the idea of talking about books one hasn't read sounds rather scandalous, you know, at first. After all, I'm sure there are a few of us who have made the terrible, awkward faux pas of claiming to have read a book that we have not, either to save face or accidentally, which I did, such as the time when I was working as a bookseller and I said that I read The Wake by Paul Kingsnorth to one of my colleagues, and their surprise really took me back, because it's not that deep a book. If you've read it, you know what I mean. It's interesting, it's not hard to read, and I sort of got offended by how baffled they were that I had read this book, and I thought, you know, he must think I'm incredibly stupid because he kept asking, really, have you read it? And I, growing more and more irritated, insisted that I had, and it was only a few hours later that I found out he asked me if I had read Finnegan's Wake, not The Wake, and I was too humiliated by how wildly I had misheard him, but also how insistent I had been, that I never corrected the error. Though a few years later I found out that I'm basically deaf in my right ear. I've got 12% hearing in that ear, so really I have an excuse, and he mumbled a lot and had a very low tone voice, so he stood very little chance against my ear. However, moving back to the topic of conversation, there's a book, Pierre Bayard's book, which is unsurprisingly titled How to Talk About the Books You Haven't Read. It argues that the way that we engage with literature exists on a spectrum, which I also agree with. It's not merely this dichotomous categories of books we have read and books we have not read. So his thesis presents different dimensions of how we engage with literature, including the books that we have read, the books we've skimmed, the books we have heard about, the books we have read but forgotten, the books that we've never opened. You get the gist. So for Bayard, literature is a compass, and the books under its umbrella are not isolated, but rather relational objects within a system in which we, the reader, employ to orient ourselves. Quote, "As cultivated people know, and to their misfortune, uncultivated people do not, culture is above all a matter of orientation. Being cultivated is a matter not of having read any book in particular, but of being able to find your bearings within books as a system, which requires you to know that they form a system and to be able to locate each element in relation to the others. The interior of the book is less important than its exterior, or if you prefer, the interior of the book is its exterior, since what counts in a book is the books alongside it." Now, that may initially sound as though Bayard is dismissing the contents within literature, reducing them to merely titles or markers of status and significance. But he's not, I do promise you. Bayard argues that to engage with literature, we must first understand the relationships between works and their position relative to each other within the collective library. Now, he claims that non-reading is, quote, not just the absence of reading, it is a genuine activity, one that consists of adopting a stance in relation to the immense tide of books that protect you from drowning. On this basis, it deserves to be defended and even taught. So Bayard identifies levels of non-reading, which he codifies as follows. You have UB, which is unknown book to me. We have SB, which is the book that I have skimmed. HB, which is the book I have heard about. And FB, which is a book I have forgotten. So rather than defining our reading culture in absolutist, linear terms, Bayard pushes for a relativist, selective approach that is free from shame and judgment. Quote, to speak without shame about books we haven't read, we would thus do well to free ourselves of the oppressive image of cultural literacy without gaps, as transmitted and imposed by family and school, for we can strive towards this image for a lifetime without ever managing to coincide with it. Truth destined for others is less important than truthfulness for ourselves, something attainable only by those who free themselves from the obligation to seem cultivated, which tyrannies us from within and prevents us from being ourselves. Only in accepting our non-reading without shame can we begin to take an interest in what is actually at stake, which is not a book, but a complex interpersonal situation of which the book is less the object than the consequence. After thinking about this, I realise it's incredibly easy for book collating to fall into the sphere of morality. After all, unread books manifest as to-do lists, which keep getting longer and longer, and in this ultra-productivity-driven world, even hobbies can become harbingers of the puritanical messages of work and moral duty, and any signifiers of sloth being blemishes of sin. On top of that, we feel as though we have broken promises to ourselves. Why haven't you become the person who reads that book? Why haven't you become the person that reads that many books a year? And this pain is only ever amplified by the mortality anxiety many of us have. When we look at these books, we are reminded again and again that life is short, even if we are fortunate enough to live a full one. And as such, we cannot read and know everything that we wish to. Thus, unread books become symbols of finitude that we are scared to confront, and it's therefore much easier to give them away or rid ourselves of them than be perpetually reminded of our own mortality by the stretch of curiosity and words that exceed our lifespans. But I would argue that what some people regard as naivety can easily be perceived by another as optimism. Unread books do not have to remind us of our limited time on Earth, but a belief in our future, and our refusal to stop growing in a world which would rather we be beaten into passive submission. The goal should not be to conquer our unread books, but simply to live alongside them in peace, and with peace of mind with ourselves and our relationship with literature. It's also important to remember that we can release the obligations we hold ourselves to. We do not owe every book completion, and the idea of having a library that we enjoy is to create for desire, not for duty. We should really only be keeping books that genuinely call to us, and only complete books that we're enjoying the process of reading, rather than just saying, well, I want to say I've read the entire thing even if I'm not enjoying it. That would be like eating food you don't enjoy just to get your calorific needs. And when I say don't enjoy, we're not talking about salad here, we're talking about things that taste foul in your mouth, and there are other foods out there. There's food all around you, but you insist on eating the foul food because, well, I have to meet my calorific needs and say that I ate it. We also should accept more cyclic reading, books that are for our future selves. You can start reading one and realise it's not the right time and move on to something else, and accept you may want to revisit it or come back to it entirely. But most importantly, we have to remind ourselves that books are our companions, not tasks we need to do. Because really, our libraries should not be a record of what we have read. It should be a map of what still moves us in a world that perpetually tries to tread us down. I hope you enjoyed today's video. If you did, please consider giving it a like and subscribing or sharing it. I really appreciate it. And thank you again to June's Journey for sponsoring today's video. I will leave the link down below in the description box, and also the QR code on the screen for you to download. And as always, thank you to my wonderful Patreons for making the video possible, including but not limited to my top tier Patreons. We have Holly is Autistic, Joshua Heredia, Gil the Gilded Dragon, Lady of the Labyrinth, Ellen, Eric Taylor, Yvonne and Yvonne, Jenny Edivane, Marina, Wee Lauren, Nicholas Reed and Andy Bazil. Thank you all so much as always, and I hope you are happy and healthy, and remember, books save lives, so keep reading.